Good afternoon. My name is Michael Gerard. I teach here at the law school, and I want to welcome you to this event, which is co-sponsored by the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health, Columbia Center for the History and Ethics of Public Health, Columbia Law School, the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, and the Columbia Climate School. We are deeply honored to have with us this afternoon Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. Senator Whitehouse is a graduate of Yale University and the University of Virginia School of Law. He served as the United States Attorney for Rhode Island and as the Attorney General of Rhode Island before being elected to the Senate in 2006. He's served on the Finance Committee, the Judiciary Committee, the Environmental and Public Works Committee, and recently became chair of the Budget Committee. Especially close to my own heart as director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law is that beginning in 2012, he spoke on the Senate floor about climate change every week that the Senate was in session until January 2021 for a total of 279 weekly climate talks, but that wasn't the end of it. They have continued. Today, Senator Whitehouse is going to talk about his latest book, The Scheme, How the Right Wing Used Dark Money to Capture the Supreme Court. First, a word about the format. The senator will talk, and then he'll open it up for questions. He needs to leave at 12:45 p.m. to go and catch a train to Washington so that he can vote this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, David, for co-hosting this. You guys have a lot of schools. It's kind of nice to be co-hosted by so many of them. I would like to talk with you for a little bit about the Supreme Court and the problems there. I've spent a lot of time looking at this. I've been legal counsel to the governor in my state. I've been attorney general of my state. I've been the U.S. attorney in my state. So I've been around legal stuff for a while. In those jobs, it was really hard to do trial work because of the time constraints, but I could do appellate work because you do a lot of that work at night and wherever, and it's just argument day that you really have to have your schedule free. So I did a lot of appellate work, and that caused me to really start to get signals, perhaps earlier than some of my colleagues, that something was really going wrong at the Supreme Court, that really basic principles of appellate adjudication and separation of powers were being pretty steadily violated, and that there should be an explanation for that. The speeches that Michael referred to on the climate stuff kind of teed me up for this, because I started giving those speeches about polar bears and evidence, and then like drilling down to like pteropods and evidence. And after a while I realized that I needed to talk about something else, which was the climate denial operation that was operating against me. And so a lot of the speeches that I gave had to do with the climate denial operation and its anonymous corporate funding, the dark money that supports it. And I kind of gave myself an amateur self-taught PhD in dark money and climate denial. And a lot of my colleagues believed me and came to the floor in fairly significant numbers to do what we called web of denial presentations and walk through the work, much of which came out of the academic community, from people like Bob Rule and Naomi Oreskes and Justin Farrell and Tyler Dunlap and others, that laid out actually how this was in fact working. So when things started to get weird at the Supreme Court, I had this experience of the dark money effort behind climate denial, and what turned up over at the court was a lot of the same people, a lot of the same groups, a lot of the same mischief, a lot of the same funding. So all of that has come together and informed where I am. I'm going to talk very briefly about the court, and then we can do questions, but the two concepts that I think you need to have in mind as you consider what is going on at the court are, one, regulatory capture. There is an enormous literature on regulatory capture, sometimes called agency capture. It's in the field of economics, it's in the field of administrative law, it's very robust. We have a lot of American practical experience with it, going back to things like railroad barons, who would control the railroad commission that was setting the railroad rates. That's not a question of conservative versus liberal. That's a question of honest versus captured. And as I began to look more and more at the court, I began to see that this was regulatory capture that had just jumped the rails and moved into the judicial branch and out of the administrative sector of government. The second concept is covert operations. I was on the intelligence committee for a while. My father was a foreign service officer. In the country team meetings where we were assigned, there was always the intelligence component present. And anybody who reads spy novels has at least an amateur familiarity with how covert operations run. And if you consider how the court was captured, and frankly how climate denial is done, the tradecraft bears a lot of resemblance to the way in which an intelligence community in one country would run a hostile operation in another country. The difference here is that using that tradecraft, the fossil fuel industry has largely run a hostile operation against our own country and government, but the technique is quite similar. So my thesis is that we have a captured court that was captured using covert operations techniques, and by the way, a lot of money. We've been tracking how much money was spent. Some years ago, the Washington Post reported that it had been $250 million spent in this enterprise to capture the court. As more digging has been done and more academic research has been done, that number is now at $580 million. Nobody spends $580 million unless they expect a return on that investment. And if you think $580 million is a big number and that is entitled to some skepticism, consider this one fact. A right-wing billionaire, whose name is Barry Seid, arranged for the sale of a company of his through a brand new 501c4 set up in Utah, so that when the sale was accomplished, the proceeds of the sale landed tax-free in the 501c4, a 501c4 controlled by Leonard Leo. You can do your own research on him, but he's been the architect and the operative of the dark money forces on court capture for a long time. He was involved in the effort that knocked Harriet Miers out. Do you remember her? The president's own legal counsel, already nominated to the Supreme Court, attacked from the right. This is a Republican president, attacked from the right, humiliatingly had to forced to withdraw her, and that brought to the court, guess who? Sam Alito. So if you want to know where Dobbs started, it was with Leonard Leo way back then when they had to knock out Harriet Miers to make a space for him. So this Leonard Leo character has been involved in this for a long time. He put together that Federalist Society list that Trump promised to follow, and he now has $1.6 billion from the sale of that company in this 501c4 that he can move around through his network of front groups, probably 24 or more, and spill out into elections, spill out into climate denial, spill out into critical race theory hysteria. Wherever they want to go with it, they have a huge, huge slush fund. So how did they do it? Well, first they put a lot of money into the Federalist Society, and they used the Federalist Society as the venue where the billionaire interests could gather, and behind closed doors and with no process. This was not an official Federalist Society activity through the board or through any of its sort of parliamentary maneuvers. They just provided a venue, and behind closed doors, these interests came in and agreed on who the nominee was going to be, who was going to be on the list, and then who the nominee was going to be. And the Federalist Society went from getting like thousands of dollars in dark money contributions to millions and millions and millions of dollars in dark money contribution, leading to the obvious theory that people paid to get in that room to be able to help pick who the next Supreme Court justice was going to be. Once they picked him, they sent the message over to Trump, this is our guy, and Don McGahn, who said he was the insourced Federalist Society as Trump's legal counsel, got them nominated, and then they came over to my shop, the Senate. And there, another group went to work called the Judicial Crisis Network. It is one of Leonard Leo's operations, and it was getting checks for $15 million, check for $17 million from unknown donors to run the ad campaigns against Garland in the first instance, and for Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett afterwards. They spent tens of millions of dollars on ad campaigns. Now, I talked about tradecraft. Their tradecraft is not that great, and they slipped a little bit, and it turns out the Judicial Crisis Network is down the hallway in the same building on the same floor as the Federalist Society. And they answer each other's doors and pick up each other's packages. So the notion that these are two completely distinct entities is a little bit of a stretch. So now you've got your nominee chosen by the president, thanks to the Federalist Society backroom operation. You've got this big spend to put pressure so that the Senate does its job and confirms them no matter how challenging their nomination is. And let me tell you, that Kavanaugh nomination was pretty challenging for the Republicans. That guy there was a lot of weight to carry. And then you've got your judge on the court once confirmed. Now what do? The last stage is to get your message in front of the court through flotillas of front group amici. And I've been writing my own amicus briefs to tell the court, oh, by the way, those other amici, here's how they're all commonly funded by the Bradley Institute, by Donors Trust, by all these right-wing groups. The court doesn't take much interest and it has not cleaned up its amicus disclosure rule. So this pipeline of direction from these right-wing donors through their front groups and into the court remains both intact and anonymous. The Judicial Conference is taking a look at this, thank goodness, and they may clean it up, but that's how it is. And then my take is that when this flotilla appears in the Supreme Court, it inevitably wins. I did an article years ago that said that if you looked at the 5-4 decisions of the Roberts Court where there was an obvious Republican donor interest, and there were 72 of them, the score was 72-0. It's a pretty good win rate. And I think further work could show that, could connect better than I've been able to so far, these front groups and their messages in the amicus brief to the decisions of the court so that that pipeline becomes even more apparent. And I'll close by saying there are a couple of areas where I think the academic community can be very helpful since I'm here in the academic community. And one is tracking exactly that. Dig into where these front groups came from, what their message was, how much the court followed it. I think you'll see 100% success in at least directionality, if not in full-on final outcome. I think we need to look hard at the ethics problems of the court, which has neither a code that is subjected to nor a process for considering whether an ethics violation has transpired. It is unique in that respect. If you go to a circuit court of appeal, you can complain to the chief judge. There is a process that follows for evaluating whether or not the ethics complaint is real and what the facts are behind it. If I have an ethics problem, you can go to the Senate Ethics Committee. They have a process for looking at whether I violated ethics. If an executive branch official has an ethics problem, you can go to the Inspector General, you can go to the Attorney General, you can look into it. The Supreme Court has no such process. It lives in an accountability-free zone, not only from the perspective of having a code to follow, but from a point of view of having any method to examine whether or not that code was violated. If you just saw the concern that was floated about the Chief Justice's spouse's vocation and employment, there was no inbox at the Supreme Court where they could bring that and file that complaint. That had to be sort of spattered around Congress and work its way to the media for anybody to follow up on it. If there's no inbox, you can pretty well bet that there's no follow-through also. That can be changed, and that should be carefully examined. I would say the last thing is that the Supreme Court has been on a real binge of fact-finding, and there's pretty good, solid tradition in law to say that the Supreme Court shouldn't do any fact-finding. Lower courts should do that, so that the adversarial process can clear out the false facts and then review reviews to make sure that the judge did a good job of clearing out the false facts, and if there's clear error, it's fixed. But otherwise, that's it. District courts, trial courts do the fact-finding. And in decision after decision after decision, it's been the Supreme Court that has been the fact-finder. Many of the facts have been false, and there's no way to review it until the Supreme Court decision comes out, and suddenly there you are, stuck with the decision, packed with false facts, and only, like in the recent Bruen case, only historians from Columbia and other universities say, wait a minute, that's actually not real history. You guys made that stuff up. That should have all taken place at the district court so that the nonsense false facts could have been filtered out. But the Supreme Court finds these things because they're necessary to get to the result that they want. And I think cleaning up that mess is important, and there's a big academic opportunity there to study that more. So that's where I think we are. I think we've got a captured court. I think it's pretty clear that big special interests did it. There's a track record of decision after decision after decision going with the interests of those big industries and interests. And it's starting to really affect all of us because Dobbs, just to answer in one word. So that's it, and I'll answer any questions you may have. Thanks for the time, and we've got about 20 minutes left before I've got to go get my train. Awkward pause. I love this moment. Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking with us, Senator. About 2 doors down right now, our school chapter of the Federalist Society is holding a lunchtime talk with Judge Park, who has, had some really scary climate decisions and worked before he was appointed to undermine our education by removing schools' abilities to consider race in admissions. I'm wondering, in addition to the academic work that you mentioned, what can and should schools, both as administrators, as students, and as professors, be doing to respond to the elements of the capture that are happening in our institutions?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say that I think the Federalist Society has 3 roles, and I only complain about one of them. I think it's totally legit for anybody who wants to try to set up a society at a law school so that people of views that they believe in can get together and talk about those views. That is like, yeah, go for it. Of course that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with setting up a Washington think tank operation to try to drive policy. It's smelly, but everybody does it. And there you are, and you're in the mix of the think tank smelliness fighting back and forth with each other. Where it gets weird and improper is when the Federalist Society hosts and to a certain extent approves a secret, private process of selecting judicial nominees. That should never have happened. It should never be accepted. If we were sending a delegation of judges to some imaginary country that was riddled with corruption, and in that corruption they had turned over the appointment of their judges to a private organization that was receiving millions of dollars in anonymous money, we would say to that country, one of our findings in our visit is that you've got a really crappy way to appoint judges that opens a massive avenue for corruption, and you really ought to fix that. But this was us, and we did it that way, and it was wrong, and we should make sure that that never happens again. I think that the danger is less that the Federalist Society is here and that it has speakers and that it does all that stuff. That's all fine. They should be doing that. I think the greater danger is when money is involved and you get, the Antonin Scalia School of Law with these massive anonymous contributions, George Mason, the Center for the Study of the Administrative State, and the danger is that academic institutions or institutions masquerading as academic institutions are in effect operating as doctrine factories for donors, and they're trying to give academic luster to what is basically a self-centered, self-serving political argument, like that there is a major questions doctrine out there, to quote a recent one, West Virginia versus EPA. And that's where the real danger is, and I think the nexus between universities taking big money from special interests and then churning out doctrine that is exactly congruent with the interests that have given the money is the big danger. As to meetings and groups on campus, go for it. More, here we go. Sparing us the awkward pause. Well done, thank you.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Yeah.
I had a question for you. So you mentioned that there's a lack of accountability in the Supreme Court because there's no ethics inbox.
Yep.
And like other, committees you mentioned in the Senate and other institutions, who would you task with holding this Supreme Court accountable, having this ethics inbox while protecting the institution?
There are a lot of different ways to do it, but let me just offer a very simple one just by way of example. And I think the Judicial Conference could actually set this up by itself. First of all, we know that the Chief Justice has the ability to ask for an investigation of something. We know that because he just did it. Now, it was kind of a botched and misshapen investigation, full of weird aspects. But the fundamental premise that the Chief Justice can ask for an investigation is established. So he could also equally set up an inbox. Anybody has a concern about the ethics of any of members of the court, bring it here. Here's the inbox. And you could hire people to take a look at that and sort out the nutty stuff from the people in the basement with the tinfoil around their heads from actually stuff that looks pretty serious and sincere. And then you could have a team that did ordinary investigative behavior, like going out and taking statements. So look at the charge that Justice Thomas should not have been involved in the January 6th case because of his wife's participation in insurrection-related activities. His defense was, nope, that was cool, because I had no idea what she was up to, none. That's a factual proposition. Factual propositions lend themselves to investigation. At least somebody could have asked him, what did you know, and when did you know it? I'm taking this little statement, and at the end you'll put your signature on it to say, yep, that's your statement, and then that's it. And if it turns out later that he's lying, then there are consequences for that false statement. But you want to go through that sort of basic standard investigative rigor. And then how do you do the decision making? The decision making, I think, the easiest way would be to say, okay, all the chief judges of all the circuits, you guys are a panel. And once we've done our facts finding, and once we've had our little investigation, we've said, here's what the deal is, we'll send it to you, and you guys decide, would this be a violation in your circuits? And if it is, then we shouldn't do it, and you can say that publicly. And while it wouldn't have any immediate effect on the Supreme Court, because it would be advisory, it would have a very powerful deterrent effect, and it would have a very powerful teaching effect, and it would in effect amount to public sanction of misbehavior because they couldn't align what the circuit judges had said with their behavior. And they could do that all within their existing authority right now with no prejudice to any significant or real judicial interest. They choose not to, and I think they choose not to for very poor reasons right now. Yeah?
Thank you for being here, Senator. So knowing that any climate or environmental legislation or a lot of other good legislation will be challenged in this current Supreme Court,
Yeah.
How do you design legislation to withstand those challenges?
Principle one should be don't pull your punches. Dare them to challenge or undo your regulation. If you've done your homework right in drafting the regulation, if you've created the factual record right, if you've gone through the work of, comment and review, and if you have written it in a way that is consistent with that evidence and with the law that you're implementing, you should be okay. And if you're not, let's have that fight. But I really, really fear the flinch away of the shadow of West Virginia versus EPA, of the shadow of the Supreme Court's biases. We shouldn't allow that to hold us back. You should do your job right, and if the Supreme Court then is a problem, then let's have that fight. But I'm afraid, there are numbers and pen numbers around what the Supreme Court is going to get up to, and we will hobble ourselves unnecessarily by trying to predict and live in fear of their sanction. We should do what's right and what works under the law, and then have the fight with them when they try to mess with it. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
Basically frightening. Would there be a role for Congress to pass laws that would make Citizens United non-applicable and even broaden it to include more than corporations, but other
Yes.
foundations or private entities?
Yeah, there actually is such a law. It's called the Disclose Act, and it's my bill. And it would require, if you spend more than $10,000 in an election, that you need to disclose yourself. And I think it has enormous public support and also like logical common sense support, and is a significant anti-corruption activity. We absolutely need to get the dark money out of politics. The Supreme Court in Citizens United said unlimited money is going to be fine because it's going to be independent of campaign, so that won't be corrupting. Wrong and wrong. And it's going to be transparent, so everybody will be able to know, and whatever danger of corruption is will be exposed in the public daylight. $2.2 billion worth of wrong in the last election. And then they completely overlooked the third element, which was that even if what they were saying was true, which it was not, the power of unlimited spending is not just in the spending. When people in my line of work know that special interest X has the power and the ability and the resources and the motive to spend 10, 15, 20 million dollars in a campaign, the threat or promise to spend that money is a very powerful feature. And all of the fancy talk about how the spending is going to be in the public view and therefore will have a chance to correct and not be corrupting is completely eviscerated, because that threat or promise is never going to be made in the public domain. It is going to be made in a back room someplace. And to open the door to that kind of threat and promise is to open the door to corruption. Yes, sir.
Similar to how Citizens United has sort of eroded people's faith in government, do you think that the taking of the Supreme Court is eroding the public's faith in the institution's credibility and legitimacy? What are some of the consequences of that?
First of all, totally. You see it absolutely in a free fall. I think it's the lowest credibility the Supreme Court's ever had. And there's this sort of a truculent, contumacious character to the Supreme Court's response to this problem, which is, how dare you? How dare you doubt us? It's un-American for you to doubt us because we rely on public support and you're withholding your public support, as if their behavior had no role in all of this and in why the public support was crashing. So I think we kind of basically have to drive toward a kind of moment of reckoning on this. There's going to be legislation there is legislation already to rein in the ethics problems of the Supreme Court, to clear up the appointments mischief by having term limits, at least diminish the appointments mischief through term limits. And because the court has been so partisan, there's a reflex now on the Republican side to protect it, whatever it does. But there's some limits to that as well, and if you build a good record, I think we can start to make inroads. And then I don't recall if I've said it in this talk, because I've said it so often, but there are areas in which the Supreme Court has blown me off on complaints and concerns that I have had. Two specific ones, the phony baloney amici curiae, and who's really behind them. And the second is gifts of hospitality that aren't even disclosed, but are very luxurious and robust and potentially influencing. And after the Supreme Court blew me off on both of those, we went to work on other courts and judges to raise the issue with them. And the result of that is that the Judicial Conference, which is the top administrative body of the judicial branch of government, has launched 2 committees, one to look at the phony baloney hospitality exemption non-disclosure, and 2 to look at who's behind amici curiae and how the rule about disclosure of who's funding an amicus should be updated. So it's kind of interesting. The Supreme Court has a very defensive view of its situation, but the other judges who actually have to live under ethics rules and see how badly the Supreme Court has departed from that are starting to show a little potential pushback. So some of this could actually happen through the judicial branch of government, not just through the legislative branch of government. There are 2 avenues to go after this. Yes?
Senator, in your opinion, would the establishment of an independent fact verification body affiliated with the Supreme Court, something analogous to the Congressional Research Service, be effective in helping to limit the way that false facts, especially those communicated either false in nature or through implication in amicus briefs, be effective in restraining this tendency of the current court?
It might be. And it would certainly be a better circumstance than right now, where the justice writing the opinion can just make up a fact or pluck it out of context from some very self-interested amicus brief and drop it into the decision where it sits like the bug in amber forever, unchallenged through the adversary process, unreviewable through the legal process, and false. That's a bad combination. The problem with an institution like that is, how do you protect its independence? How does it not become a captured thing that is then delivering and serving up the false facts that the justices are finding? To me, the best way to do that is not with new so-called independent bodies, but to push the fact-finding function down to the trial court level and make sure that's where it always starts. And then the adversarial process and the appellate process can bring their healthy, time-tested scrutiny and process to bear to eliminate some of the nonsense facts. If the nonsense facts behind Bruen, the gun case, or the nonsense facts behind Dobbs, the abortion case, had been first ventilated in the district court, then the historians' critiques of those facts, saying that this is essentially nonsense, in fact, that was a word that was used by one historian, would then have been ventilated in that process. And there would have been back and forth, and there would have been a finding, and it would have been subject to rules of judicial procedure. And if there was clear error, the appellate court could have knocked out the clear error and sent it back for a better open, public, adversarial process. To me, we already have the mechanism to do this. The problem is that that fact-finding function has improperly migrated from where it belongs in the district court up to these like free-range fact findings that are past review, extra record, dispositive of the case, and false. Yeah?
Why do you trust the lower branches of the judiciary across the United States now, given the fact that many, many fellows of the Federal Society have been appointed as appellate court judges?
I don't necessarily trust them, but I trust the process. And for every wacky Trump judge who makes some like wild decision, like this, or an appellate court like the recent Fifth Circuit decision saying that the right to bear arms is more significant than the laws taking away a weapon from somebody who is a live threat to domestic violence. I think the process is the best we have. And there are going to be failures, but I don't think that anything else has replaced it. And the reason it's stood since Blackstone and all the way back to Henry II, the jury system, is because by and large it actually works pretty well. And you've got people like David Rosner who've added a lot of expertise into that process over the years in important cases. And I think David has confidence in the process generally. Even when you get a bad judge, the system overall, I think, tends to work. Look at Alex Jones. Look at Dominion and Fox News. There are some really major cases where big, bad, smelly... Look at the lawyers who put forward Trump's lies about the election. There have been some really strong court decisions and sanctions about that. An honest courtroom cures a lot. And with that, we'll do one last question, and then I'll have to go get my train.
Yeah, I was wondering what attempts and conversations are like with working with Republicans on the things that you propose. What are those conversations like? Is there support?
Extremely, extremely cautious. Extremely, extremely cautious. The pearl beyond price of the dark money operation upon which the Republican Party floats is the capture of the Supreme Court. That has allowed them to accomplish things, not the Republican Party, the donor elite behind it. That has allowed them to accomplish things that they could not get through Republican-controlled Congresses. There's just some you-know-what that even Republicans will not eat, to quote a poet. And so you go to the unelected, undemocratic, unaccountable branch of government and fill them up with theories that point them in the direction you want, and pick the people you want who've indicated they will go there, and there goes major questions doctrine. Here comes Roe overturned. You know, you deliver things that way. So it is hard to overstate the importance to the same apparatus that funds the Republican Party of its control over the judicial branch. And if you want an example of that, look at how they all had to vote for Kavanaugh. This was not an easy vote. Every single one of those Republican senators has a domestic violence coalition at home. It has people who they know who've been victims of sexual assault and can understand that Dr. Blasey Ford's testimony was exactly the way victims of violence recall things and don't recall things. They had a whole constituency that knew what they were doing was wrong. And it didn't matter because the political power behind getting on that court was relentless. And that is the problem with working with Republicans. The closest I've got is Lindsey Graham said they should have the same rules as everybody else about ethics disclosure. Ridiculous that they shouldn't. So he's my ally on that, but allies are short and conversations are secret. Thank you all very much for being interested in this.